Well, Your Honor, at least I can say I've still got my balls. As soon as the words left my mouth, I caught the faint sound of a sharp hiss coming from my lawyer. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed him fixating on me with an expression that seemed equal parts disbelief and frustration. For someone who charged by the hour at rates that could make a billionaire wince, you'd think he'd have a little more composure. He hadn't just advised me against using that line. He had practically pleaded with me to drop it entirely. According to him, public sympathy was a precious commodity, one that could nudge judges toward a more lenient sentence. But what he didn't realize was that I had an insight he lacked. From my vantage point at the defendant's bench, handcuffed and all, I had a clear view of the judge. I saw how, the first time I dropped that infamous phrase, his lips had twitched into a barely concealed smile. That, paired with the quick glance he shot toward the so-called victim sitting scowling at his lawyer's table, told me everything I needed to know. I had a sneaking suspicion that the judge wasn't exactly a fan of that guy either. "May I have another word with my client, Your Honor?" my lawyer asked, clearly desperate. The judge shook his head with a smirk. "I doubt it'll do much good, Mr. Perkins. Your last attempt to reason with him didn't seem to work." As my lawyer approached me, muttering something I couldn't quite catch, I couldn't help but feel a pang of irritation. The truth was, I didn't like the guy. I was a practical man who preferred dealing with problems head-on, and he came off as arrogant and dismissive. If I'd had a say, I never would have hired him. But it wasn't my choice to make. He was there because of my best friend, Dave. And no, Dave wasn't some obscenely rich benefactor capable of funding a losing battle just for fun. Dave was just a regular guy living a comfortable, unremarkable life, much like I used to before I landed myself in this mess. The reason I had such an exorbitantly priced legal team was because Dave had organized a GoFundMe campaign. To my surprise, it had drawn contributions from an overwhelming number of people. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who despised the guy I'd assaulted. When word of the fundraiser's success hit the media, the so-called victim had launched his own crowdfunding campaign. That little stunt backfired spectacularly. Seems like antagonizing me didn't win him any friends. Meanwhile, I'd become unexpectedly popular, judging by the mountain of fan mail piling up for me. It was an odd feeling, but I couldn't deny that it gave me a certain confidence. After yet another plea from my lawyer to drop the phrase, he finally returned to his seat, leaving me to face the judge once more. "Mr. Freeland," the judge said, his voice firm yet betraying a faint twinkle in his eye that only I could catch from where I sat. "Your attorney is right. The victim deserves more respect than what you've shown." I put on my best apologetic face. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. I thought I was just stating the facts. I have a pair of testicles. The guy I caught sleeping with my soon-to-be ex-wife doesn't. Unless, of course, he keeps them in a jar somewhere." The judge's eyes narrowed, and I realized I might have pushed it too far this time. But then his expression softened, and I decided, for once, to hold my tongue. "As I was saying, Mr. Freeland, you've pleaded guilty to assault causing bodily harm. This offense carries a maximum sentence of 8 years in prison." The judge continued, consulting his notes. "No, please don't repeat what you said last time." I followed his gaze toward the prosecution table, where my victim had turned an alarming shade of red. Whether it was from rage, humiliation, or both, I couldn't be sure. "Thank you, Mr. Freeland," the judge said, redirecting his attention to me. "Now, your attorney argues that you were in a state of temporary insanity at the time of the assault and shouldn't bear full responsibility. The psychiatric evaluation, however, suggests otherwise. The report describes you as mentally sound, but it does acknowledge that temporary insanity can be an autonomous response to extreme stimuli." This time, I kept my mouth shut, finally taking my lawyer's advice to only answer direct questions. "We've heard the victim's statement," the judge went on. "Before I pass sentence, Mr. Freeland, I'd like you to look me in the eye and recount your side of the story." I nodded, taking a moment to collect myself. My gaze drifted to the gallery, where my wife sat. She avoided my eyes, staring at her lap. This was the first time she'd been present during the retelling of this story. I guessed she'd hoped to dodge the discomfort of hearing it in the courtroom. Clearly, she hadn't anticipated it would resurface today. Her head remained bowed, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. If I were in her position, I'd feel trapped, wrestling with the consequences of my choices. And so I began. Decisions. Should she bolt out of the courtroom, avoiding my gaze and the judgmental stares from the gallery? Or should she stay put, feigning support in the hopes that I'd somehow forgive her and take her back? Fat chance. She was on her own to endure the humiliation and public disgrace that came with being caught cheating in the unrelenting glare of everyone's attention. That night it all started so innocently. My wife, a few friends, and I were having a pleasant evening at the bar. Things were going smoothly until some loafer, no scratch that, the so-called victim decided to stroll over and ask my wife to dance. Now, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I believe in a bit of barroom etiquette. The guy should have had the decency to ask me if I was okay with it first. He didn't. I didn't like it, but I figured it wasn't worth causing a scene. She danced with him. Once, twice, maybe 3 times, and then she returned to the table. I told myself everything was fine. Nothing to worry about, right? At least, that's what I thought until she disappeared a little later. Turns out, she left with the very man she'd been dancing with. I had to stop speaking for a moment to calm myself. Even now, after all this time, just thinking about her betrayal made my blood boil. The memory was like a fresh wound, one that refused to heal. One of the psychiatrists I spoke to during my evaluation mentioned something that stuck with me. He said, "Where there's deep pain, there's bound to be strong anger." He described anger as a secondary emotion, one that's fueled by the hurt lying underneath. If nothing else, I suppose I learned something new in prison. "Please continue, Mr. Freeland," the judge prompted. "Well, Your Honor, I figured he'd taken her straight to his place. A few people knew where he lived, so I headed there right away. Sure enough, his big, shiny car was parked in the garage. They must have been in quite the hurry because not only was the garage door wide open, but the door leading into the house was unlocked too. I didn't have to force my way in. I just walked right through. For the record, there's no mention of any property damage in the police report." The judge raised an eyebrow but let me continue. "You'll have to forgive me, Your Honor, but my memory gets a little hazy from this point on," I said, trying to sound as sincere as possible. "I remember wandering through the house, getting angrier with every step as I searched for them. Then I found myself at the base of a staircase. That's when I heard it, grunting and moaning coming from a bedroom upstairs. I'm sorry, but that's all I can recall. Everything after that is a blank until the police arrived." I paused, glancing at the judge to gauge his reaction. One moment, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs, and the next, the cops were there. As for what happened during that 15-minute gap, I honestly don't know if the images in my head are real or if they're just based on what the police told me during their interrogation. They claimed I must have done certain things, but I couldn't be sure. I kept my expression as neutral as I could while the judge scrutinized me. My lawyer had built much of his defense on the idea that my signed confession wasn't valid. His argument was that I wasn't in my right mind when I gave it. Apparently, there were gaps in the police's custody logs, and my lawyer had planted the idea that I might have been interrogated off the record. He suggested that the officers might have taken advantage of my mentally vulnerable state, repeating a fabricated version of events until I started to believe it myself. The truth? I remembered everything. Every single detail. The memory burned itself into my mind like a scar. I could still hear the sounds of sex coming from that bedroom, driving me up those stairs, step by agonizing step. The door was open when I got there, and there she was, my wife, on all fours, naked as the day she was born, being taken by that bastard. The same smug jerk she'd been dancing with earlier that night. Was it madness? Maybe, but something inside me snapped at that moment. And frankly, I don't think anyone could blame me for what happened next. They didn't notice me at first. The two of them were too engrossed in their little performance to realize they had an audience. She was moaning, screaming, encouraging him in ways that obliterated even the faintest hope that she might have been coerced into this. No, she was fully willing, and it shattered me in ways I didn't know were possible. A sex party. That's what it felt like. A grotesque display, burned into my memory. I couldn't help but notice that his manhood was, well, significantly larger than mine. The thought that he was giving her something I never could sent a wave of pure, unfiltered rage through me. In that moment, I realized a harsh truth. I'd forever be a cuckold. No matter what I did, I'd never measure up to him, unless I found a way to level the playing field. It's hard to explain what happened next because I don't remember making a deliberate choice. It was more of an instinctual reaction, like my body acted before my mind caught up. A single thought echoed in my head. Maybe I'll always be a cuckold, and maybe my manhood will never compare to his, but at least I'll still have my pride. Growing up, I played rugby as a defender. During practice, I'd often switch sides and play against my own team. That experience taught me precision. Specifically, how to kick where it counts with incredible accuracy and force. So I did exactly that. The impact was immediate and, in hindsight, almost comical. He lurched forward, howling in pain, his body twisting awkwardly as he tried to escape the agony. In the process, he knocked my wife's head against the headboard, stunning her. Then, like a fallen tree, he toppled backward onto the bed, legs spread wide, gasping for air like he'd just been dragged up from the bottom of the ocean. For a moment, he didn't seem to register what had happened. His dazed eyes flicked between his mangled groin and my face. When he finally processed the damage, the sheer terror in his expression was enough to make me smirk. Even now, locked away, the memory of that look still brings me a grim satisfaction. Yes, Mr. Freeland, the judge's voice cut through my recollection. Your lawyer has emphasized those points thoroughly. The police department involved has already made significant changes to their protocols as a result of this case. While it's clear you were at the scene of the incident, and witnesses confirmed you administered first aid to the victim, that act of charity doesn't quite align with your character. Furthermore, the fact that your wife didn't actually see you assault the victim is irrelevant. The evidence clearly shows you caused the injuries that resulted in the surgical removal of the victim's testicles. I remained silent, waiting for the hammer to fall. The primary issue here, the judge continued, is your mental state at the time. While the maximum sentence for assault causing bodily harm is 8 years in prison, I am allowed to consider mitigating factors, such as the provocation you endured and its impact on your likely mental state. At this point, the judge cast a disgusted glance at my wife. The weight of his gaze made her shrink into her seat. She looked so small and fragile, as though she were trying to disappear. I couldn't help but notice the empty chairs around her. None of her friends had shown up to offer support. From what I'd heard through whispers in the quiet confines of my cell, she didn't have many friends left. My case had become a national sensation. At first, the media focused on the notoriety of my victim. Then, they shifted to stories about celebrities who used their fame to indulge in morally bankrupt behavior with little to no consequence. And finally, they zeroed in on the GoFundMe campaign. It seemed that several of the husbands who'd been humiliated by my wife's lover were wealthy men. Their contributions alone pushed the fund into six-figure territory before the general public even got involved. My David versus Goliath story struck a nerve with thousands of people. Spare change poured in from all over the country, sometimes much more than that. The sheer size of the fund ensured its infamy, keeping me and my wife's sins at the forefront of the nation's attention. As a result, my wife became a social pariah. Publicly condemning her wasn't just acceptable. It was expected. I must have gotten lost in my thoughts because, suddenly, I became aware of applause echoing through the courtroom. Startled, I looked around and saw people smiling at me, giving me thumbs up as they stood. The judge had left the room. I turned to my lawyer, confused. What the hell just happened? You got lucky, man, he said with a grin. The judge ruled that you were temporarily insane. You've been sentenced to probation and a 3-year suspended sentence. You're a free man. He extended his hand and we shook. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to feel a flicker of hope. As I was escorted out of the courthouse, my best friend greeted me with a hearty handshake, a slap on the back, and a whispered, "I'm really glad you still have your balls, man." He walked alongside me, grinning from ear to ear, while my ever-serious lawyer kept a more composed demeanor. We exited through the back door, skillfully avoiding the waiting horde of reporters. Once we were outside, I thanked my lawyer for his efforts, and we parted ways. As I rounded the corner of the courthouse steps, I couldn't resist glancing toward the main entrance. There, a swarm of journalists lingered, cameras ready to capture their next big story. Frankly, swarm feels generous. Pack, the collective term for hyenas, seemed far more fitting. Thankfully, my change from prison attire must have thrown them off the scent. I walked right past without so much as a glance in my direction. Across the street, however, another group had gathered. To my dismay, there was my so-called victim, holding an impromptu press conference. He stood with his lawyer on the lower steps, flanked by half a dozen cameras. As I moved closer, their voices became clearer. "I vow to appeal today's ruling," the former local star declared, his tone brimming with indignation. This was a travesty of justice. Furthermore, I will file a civil lawsuit to clear my name because, let's be honest, having sex with married women is not a crime. First, only one cameraman turned toward me, then another. By the time I reached the same level on the steps, half the cameras had shifted in my direction. The man towering over me, nearly a foot taller and at least 50 kilos heavier, suddenly seemed less imposing as I stepped into his personal space. To my amusement, he backed away, stumbling over his own feet and landing flat on his backside. For a moment, he sat there, dumbstruck, until the realization of how weak he looked on camera struck him. His eyes darted to the lenses, and his expression shifted from embarrassment to fury. I flashed him my most confident smile. Good luck with that appeal and civil suit. Whether I win or lose, I'm still standing by my opinion. His face turned a brilliant shade of crimson as he spat back. "Screw you, and screw you too, Mark Lavalier." The next day's headlines were pure gold. Local papers ran variations like "Husband keeps his cool," "Little guy stands up to disgraced football star," and my personal favorite, "Lavalier loses his cool again." The coverage sparked a fresh wave of public interest in my case, and my GoFundMe account continued to grow. With the extra funds, I hired the best civil attorney I could find, hoping to soften the blow of an inevitable lawsuit. But as 1 month turned into 2, the anticipated legal battle never materialized. I finally got my answer one evening, as I sipped a beer at a local bar on my way home. A shadow loomed over me, a large man standing behind me. Without turning around, I heard his deep voice, calm but firm. "Don't look back. I'm part of a men's support group that helps husbands who've been wronged." Intrigued, I stayed silent as he continued. "Let's just say a few members of our group had a little chat with Lavalier. He's decided not to file that lawsuit against you." I didn't press for details, but considering the size of this man and the company he likely kept, it wasn't hard to imagine why Lavalier might have reconsidered. I offered to buy my mysterious ally a beer, but he declined. Instead, I thanked him and respected his wish not to turn around until he'd left. Sometimes it's nice to have friends, even if you've never met them. After that, I kept tabs on Mark Lavalier's career out of curiosity. It wasn't long before he was quietly pushed out of the major leagues, where he'd once been a star. He ended up in the minors, and according to media reports, his income plummeted by over 90%. About a year later, his name resurfaced. He appeared on one of those evening talk shows that drag out former celebrities for sympathy or ridicule. A friend recorded it for me. There he was, whining in a noticeably higher-pitched voice about the unfairness of his situation. He blamed the loss of his testicles for everything: his testosterone levels, his muscle mass, even his drive and aggression. Every time he stepped onto the field, he faced ridicule from the crowd, which only seemed to fuel his downfall. It was no surprise when he was eventually suspended for 2 games. After an opponent allegedly whispered, "At least I still have my balls." During a game, the cameras caught Mark Lavalier spinning around and slapping the guy across the face. If he'd thrown a punch, it might have earned him a shred of respect. But a slap? That only cemented his downward spiral and made him the butt of even more jokes. Less than a month later, he was fired from his team after getting caught using testosterone supplements. The banned substances were considered performance enhancers in professional sports, and his career couldn't withstand another scandal. That was the last I heard of him, aside from his occasional mention in discussions about the consequences of marital infidelity. As for Linda, things didn't go much better for her. Her friends, relatives, and acquaintances quickly realized that siding with her would drag them into the mess she'd created. They abandoned her without hesitation, flinging accusations and insults her way as they distanced themselves. The media didn't hold back either. They laid out every sordid detail of her betrayal for public consumption. Linda became the poster child for what people saw as the epitome of a bad wife. Alone, hounded by reporters and strangers alike, she tried to escape the public eye by leaving the area. But even that wasn't simple. My family lawyer, a man whose expertise was worth every penny, made sure she couldn't take the kids far from me. When her desperation reached its peak, she turned to alcohol. Things came to a head one day when my kids, left alone at home, called to tell me she'd driven into the garage through the sliding doors and wouldn't wake up. I made sure the police arrived before I did. As a strategic move, I left the garage door wide open, ensuring that reporters could snap photos of the kids' play equipment sitting innocently next to the wreckage where Linda usually parked her car. Her DUI arrest was the final nail in the coffin. My lawyer, always one step ahead, convinced the judge that Linda was an unfit mother. Of course, he didn't suggest that custody should go to me. After all, I was a convicted felon. Instead, he proposed that my parents become the children's legal guardians. Backed by the financial support I was able to provide, thanks to my loyal supporters, the judge agreed without much hesitation. I moved in with my parents to stay close to my kids. Meanwhile, Linda spiraled further, drinking more heavily than ever. Her behavior attracted the attention of social workers who were monitoring her visits with the children. Within a few months, she gave up and left the area entirely. Now, she sends postcards for birthdays and Christmas. The kids barely notice them, they've stopped caring. As for me, my notoriety attracted a certain type of woman. They were drawn to the infamy, the headlines, the scandal. Things might have worked out if I'd been the kind of man interested in those women, but I wasn't. Eventually, I met someone remarkable. Incredible doesn't quite do her justice. I admire her deeply. She fled her war-torn country with 2 young children, her nieces, after losing her sister and brother-in-law early in the conflict. She's strong, resilient, and fiercely loving. And most importantly, she loves me for who I am, not for the spectacle surrounding my past. Late at night, after we finished playing silly games of hide and seek with the kids, she sometimes leans in close and whispers in my ear, "I'm glad you still have your balls, Jim."